Michael, John, thank you very much. I've only been here in the centre for 2 hours, but that's long enough to know it's a special place. You can get a feeling in your bones as to whether somewhere is buzzing, has a devoted group of people. It is clearly special. You obviously cherish it as you've turned up this evening, but carry on cherishing it. It's a as Michael suggested, I've been quite a lot of places in the world, and it is a special place, and it's got that feeling, and well done, Dublin. It's a terrific thing to do. Just some background on what you're going to hear. Can we take down the spots? Just some background as to the slightly odd talk you're going to be hearing today. They come out of my writing a regular column, as it was, once weekly, then monthly, and now bigger pieces more occasionally in the scientific magazine Nature. This was their first masthead in 1869. I've not been writing since 1869 for Nature, but under the new editorial regime it feels a bit like that. And during the course of these items, which I've been doing since 1997, they were clearly separate objects, but various themes emerged. And the one that emerged most prominently was what I've called structural intuitions. Somebody doesn't say their R's very well. It's probably not a very good thing to have called it. But anyway, I'll say a little word about that. A bit of advertisement, anybody who wants to follow this up. The Nature column till up to 2000 was published as an anthology with an introduction called Visualizations, now I think out of print. Seen Unseen is in print, and there are copies lurking over there, which I shall be happy to sign. And as an impoverished emeritus professor, I need every bit of help I can get, so be kind. And a book that was done when I retired from Oxford, which involved scientists, artists, and some art historians, including Carl Grimes, who is sitting in the front row and did an absolutely lovely piece on birds, which some of you may have seen in one shape or another. So this is just the little commercial, but Seen Unseen is here and can be bought for your hard-earned money. The idea of structural intuitions is, in a way, naive and childish in its origins. I can remember as a child being fascinated by the shapes of nature, both dynamic and static. Things like the shapes of fir cones, the patterns on cactuses, the heads of sunflowers, the shapes of nuts, shapes of eggs, flames in the fire, but water going down the bath plug. And I remember just being fascinated by them and delighting in them. And I think we probably all do that, don't we? We all have that sense of something in nature, we go past it and we think, that's... And it's something which we visually react to. And I think we do it inherently because we are order junkies. Amongst this myriad of sensory impressions coming into us, we've got to make structural sense of it. We've got to draw patterns out of this apparent chaos. So I think we're very geared up for doing this. And at this childish level, I think we're exercising that first bit of play with order and perception without realizing it is. Of course, as we get older, we can ask questions. We can say, why does it look like that? Children ask questions, but we can ask questions in specific research programs. This is a walnut, as you recognize, a little chocolate Easter egg, which one of my friend's children's gave me one year, and it was on my pine table in the kitchen. And I thought, nice resonant forms. This is the nut, which I use as a worry bead, and you can see from the shine on it, I've got enough worries to keep me going. You look at that and you say, is there anything in common in these sort of beehive-shaped forms? There needn't be. One of the messages of searching for common pattern in nature, as Darcy Thompson found, is that you can get echoes of shapes which have no consequence at all in terms of causative mechanisms or any process we can discern. So it may be that the knot, the nut, and the egg actually require quite separate explanations, but maybe not. And very often it's this lateral move where you move from explaining the shape of an egg and explaining the shape of a nut. That often is where most exciting things happen. And artists and scientists often start from that point, don't they? That kind of itch of saying, that's interesting. It looks like something. Artists do that habitually, but scientists do. It doesn't get through to the papers. It doesn't get through to Nature or Scientific American or wherever it is. What we get in there is it has been observed that. But behind that language is often this often inarticulate enthusiasm which gets somebody going in a particular area. And it's this what I mean by structural intuitions. It's intuition structures out there and the cognitive structures which respond to it, partly predetermined and partly by a process of making and matching. Let me give you an idea of one nice one in action. And this was one of the earlier ones I wrote about in Nature, and it involved an English artist, Jonathan Callan, working in London. I used to refer to him as a young English artist. I'm not quite sure I can do that anymore. And I went into his studio, and he was sieving powder. It turned out to be white cement powder. And I said, Jonathan, what are you doing? He said, I'm sieving powder. And I said, I can see that. That he was sieving it onto a plate, a platform, which had holes drilled in it. Not regularly, but equally not totally randomly. There was a sense that they shouldn't be too close together. And he sieved this cement powder on it. He found it ran rather well, and it dropped through. And this is a cross-section, or it's a side view of a model, one of his initial tries for this. And you see what you get. The underbit isn't seen in the actual work, but you get this amazing... What is that? Is that a nano landscape? Is it a full-size landscape? Is it a delta? Is it a mountainscape? He fills rooms of this, or in this case, as you can see, it's in a little stone enclosure. And they are incredibly beguiling in terms of the suggestions of different things on different scales that are going on. I said to him, being rather a smart ass, do you know about pair back and self-organized criticality? That's the science which takes off from sand piles. And you've probably all done this. You drip sand out of your hand and it causes a cone. And then every so often you get catastrophic avalanches, which are unpredictable. Even a simple computer model of a sand pile with more sand being dripped, and it becomes unpredictable even on a relatively simple model. He said no, but got very interested in it. But he had an intuition about the behavior of the materials and the way in which the peak heights must be related in some way to the hole spacing, etc., etc. I published the piece in Nature illustrating his work and saying, this relates to pair back and this science of self-organized criticality, which has been applied to traffic jams and all sorts of other areas. What then happened is that Adrian Webster, an astronomer in Edinburgh at the Royal Observatory, wrote in, and I'd actually got a photograph from the top, which I showed in Nature, which is not the photograph I have here, and said, he said, these are Voronoi cells. That is to say, if you take a point as a sink or a vacuum, and you have a particulate surface, particles on a surface, they will obviously go to one hole or the other. And the boundaries which determine to which hole a particular particle or unit will go are separated by this cellular structure. Those are the walls which denote the attraction of the particular vacuum or sink. And he did on the right, as you can see there, that coloured model is a 3D computer simulation of it. And why should an astronomer be interested in Voronoi cells? because they were thinking about the possibility that galaxies might be arranged in a three-dimensional way in a Voronoi foam along the walls of the cells. Whether this is right or wrong actually doesn't concern me. I'm concerned with the nature of the perception and the where you can get from an intuitive starting point. This was then taken up by Ian Stewart in Scientific American in his mathematical recreations. So from Jonathan Callan in the London studio, sieving cement dust onto a plate just to see what happens, we got to Scientific American, Nature, and fundamental hypotheses about the organizations of the galaxies. That's one of the delights of this area, is that where you end up, as we will see in another case, is not where you expect. And this is really just by going back to these basic perceptions and doing what conventionally is called lateral thinking, not a term I much like. I'd much rather call it looking to the side to see what's happening beside. One of the most beautiful acknowledgements of this kind of process is Einstein writing to Jacques Hadamard. But before we look at that specific quotation, the one in black is, I think, one of my favorite ones. Imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited. Imagination encircles the world. It's a kind of cliche, but a very profound one. But the other quote is Jacques Hadamard was writing around asking scientists and people about their thought processes, and this is an excerpt of what Einstein said, and I'm showing him in his patent office look rather than the wild, later archetypal genius Einstein. The words or language, he responded to Hadamard, as they are written or spoken, do not seem to play any role in my mechanism of thought. The psychical entities which seem to serve as elements in thought are certain signs, more or less clear images, which can be voluntarily reproduced and combined. The combinatory play seems to be an essential feature in productive thought before there is any connection with logical construction in words or other kinds of signs which can be communicated to others. I think a lovely, lovely quotation. And we should remember that a lot of Einstein's intuitive processes were as much somatic as visual. If you're dealing with relativity, if you're dealing with stretching and bending of space, to do that visually in multidimensional space and so on, it's not accessible to orthodox visual modeling. So there's a lot of conjoined visual and somatic intuition going on. And it was interesting to me to look at the Midas work upstairs, and this really highlights a kind, what I'd call tactile intuition, where a lot of what we feel is not just visual, but is actually bodily as well. And of course, the laboratory, or in Katz's laboratory, the processes are physical. So these are not just abstract thought processes, but all throughout you've got the stuff, the fluids, the stickiness, the setting up the apparatus, turning it on, making connections. So in the context particularly of this exhibition, I would emphasize that structural intuitions are not just visual, but they're very much related to our bodies, the gravity, the force, the thickness, the thinness, the weight, and so on, and all these extraordinary abilities we have to envisage physical processes even before they're realized. Anyway, that's just some preliminary skirmishing, albeit at a certain length. Now I'm going to look at two case studies which I think have resonances. They're not about the exhibition here, but they're both dynamic and biological to a degree. The first one is three-dimensional geometry and vortices, particularly vortices in organic contexts, and the second is splashing. They both begin with Leonardo. It's a good starting point, and I think I'm rather expected to begin there, so I don't want to disappoint anyone. For the geometric solids, or three-dimensional geometry, were the fundamental building blocks of nature. On the left, two illustrations for a very beautiful manuscript he illustrated for Luca Pacioli, his mathematician friend in Milan in 1498, De Divina Proportione, on divine proportion. This is a dodecahedron which has been truncated, that's to say it's had its points cut off and reduced to a certain stage where the cuts, as it were, join, creating a stellated dodecahedron, or an icosydodecahedron, if you want all the language. Leonardo invented this technique of showing them solid. They'd always been shown with linear diagrams before, and the even more brilliant technique of fenestration, of opening up these windows so that we can say, that's how that thing works. On the right is a page from Milan, which shows him thinking on the page about these. And clearly, like Kepler and like a number of other people, he could do this in his mind. He had a terrific ability. A trick you can, or a task you can set an audience is to say, if you take a cube and you slice off the corners symmetrically till you can't get any further, what shape do you get? I won't tell you, you can just work on it quietly. Some people do it just like that, and some people have to take out pencil and paper and have an enormous trouble with it. And it's not a matter of intelligence. It's a particular mode of visualization. I can do it pretty well, but it doesn't mean to say I'm super intelligent in other things. And I can't add up a column of figures without making a mistake. So there are very, very peculiar quirks of the mind involved in this kind of thing. And Leonardo had a mind which was full of quirks. Developing in the printed edition in 1509, so these very complicated forms. This is one with prisms, or pyramids, if you like to call them such, built up on the faces. Three-dimensional visualization of an extraordinary kind. Leonardo, I suspect, could turn them in his mind. And what we did for the... No, it is going to play, okay. For some reason it's not appeared on my screen. So. Yep. In the Leonardo exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum in 2003, we, as it were, scratched visual itches that Leonardo couldn't scratch with the media involved, available to him. There's a kind of nice sort of, you can see how that comes about. Writing a 250-word label, if you've got a stellated and truncated icosydodecahedron on the exhibit, is hard going. So, but as soon as it moves, then we're really in business in a large way. For Leonardo, these geometrical forms were embedded in nature. They were part of the fundamental order which God had put in nature for our edification and our extraction. And this knowledge came not from abstract mathematical speculation for Leonardo, but it was a concrete knowledge which was to be drawn bodily out of nature. Here the famous Vitruvian Man, based upon the prescription of the Roman architect of the man inscribed in a square and a circle. Recently with Marcus de Sotoy, we did a television program on this for the BBC, and I suspect iPlayer, if you type in Vitruvian Man, you should get the program. I think it worked out pretty nicely. And the human engineer, the human maker of things, would learn from these fundamental shapes, which could be combined and recombined. From this basic template of geometry, you could get infinite variations. It's a form of iteration and variation. You could create an infinite number of central temples, all on the same ground base, but all distinctively different and with different visual rhythms. In Leonardo's case, he was, in one particular instance, very dramatically able to take this geometry into an organic context, into a context of what we would now call physiology. And this occurred above all in the heart valves, the aortic valves, these three-cusp, tricuspid valves in the heart. This is a big double sheet from late in his life, from 1513. It's a kind of culmination of a mode of thinking. And I've inset into that big double sheet this very brilliant little isolating the valves and showing them above and below open and closed. And we think, well, that's how people demonstrate things, but no, nobody had done that kind of visualizing something as a tangible, concrete object. And there's quite a lot of feel in this, isn't there? It's just not just a visual thing. And I'd been looking at this in my Leonardo writings as a wonderful example of how you could bring knowledge from water flow, which he was greatly interested in as an engineer of water, and bring it into another area where you couldn't see the flow. And Leonardo in these two sheets is looking theoretically, this is theoretical modelling, at the vortices in the neck of the aorta as it encounters this flask shape. So these ionic volutes of vortices spiral back, and they fill the valve cusps. The valve cusps are passive. They have no muscle in them at all, so they're operated by turbulence. In the top right-hand corner, that flask-shaped one, he says, make it in glass and put the membranes in. The first occasion I know of a model being used as a test, as a proof. Again, we tend to look at that and think, well, it's an obvious thing to do, but it wasn't obvious. It's a very new way of demonstrating things. That I was working on as somebody interested in Leonardo and his mode of thinking, of transferring, say, findings of this sort. This is a report he was almost certainly writing for the Florentine authorities as to why these two weirs, which were supposedly calming down the Arno, were actually causing destructive erosion in the bank. I won't go into that, but you can see the kind of visual thinking and observation that's going on. And that's exactly what he takes into the heart, this notion of these very powerful, what I've called the ionic volute vortices, the ones that spiral back in this particular way. I was then contacted while having written a little bit about this and thinking about it, by Maury Garib at Caltech in California, who is professor of aeronautical and biological engineering. Terrifically Leonardesque thing to be. And he said he was interested in this and was going to build the model. He was going to build the Leonardo heart model. So I was in America at that point, so I went out and we saw him, and we subsequently published on this. But there on the right is Leonardo's model with his picture of the vortices, and there's a little picture of the aorta he built. And on the right, something which you can only now see through modern imaging techniques, the vortices in the valve itself as structured. And this is actually before the membranes go in, but you can see the uncanny sense, not whether Leonardo is right or wrong, but he knew the kind of answer which was needed. By transferring knowledge from his canal engineering, his water engineering, into this area where nothing could be seen at all, where you clearly cannot inspect that in the way in which you now can. And at the same time, and this is one of the delights of this area, it's a bit like the Jonathan Callan story, Francis Wells of Papworth Hospital, one of the leading heart places in England, a major surgeon of valve replacements, world-class, also was interested in the valve and we met and we had a correspondence, ended up with him actually marrying someone in the Universal Leonardo project. So you never know what's going to happen. But he then started published with Maury Garib about the dynamics of blood in this valve and in the other heart valves. And in one of the valves, and this is a slide which Francis uses, the mitral valve was always said to be a two-leaflet valve, a bi-leaflet valve. Looking at Leonardo's drawings, Francis decided that it actually, in effect, was a quadri-leaflet valve, as Leonardo had shown, and he's rewritten the fundamental surgery of the mitral valve, and his patients call it the Leonardo operation. Again, this is not to prove the Leonardo right. I'm not really scoring sort of points in that way, but it's saying there's an amazing sense of how you intuit where the action is and where the solution is. And as anyone in arts or sciences will tell you, really, the question and having an intuition as to where the answer lies is the big deal. Finding it is hard work, but without those the initial creative input, then you are nowhere. And this is the video which resulted, and here, happily, there's a credit on this one to Steve Maher, the animator I worked with, who's very brilliant. Sometime we've been planning a television program, but haven't yet got finance for it. Keep your eye on the little valves. They're fun, aren't they? This again is from the Victoria and Albert Museum show. Leonardo would have loved his drawings to have moved, and we can. Well, once again, that like the Jonathan Callan story shows that you can. There's an amazing journey you can get involved in. Leonardo helps, as everybody knows about Leonardo, but it's not isolated, as we saw in the case of the Jonathan Callan one. Anyway, that's Leonardo, organic geometry, modern surgery, and modern techniques for visualizing flow in aerodynamics and water dynamics and so on. The second bit is splashing. Again, Leonardo, inevitably. This is one of the marginal illustrations in the Codex Leicester, which, as Michael John said, we're doing a website for. We're at the moment in the heavy-duty lifting and carrying stage of retranscribing and retranslating it all, which is terrifically hard work, because Leonardo is writing in Italian about things that nobody had written about in Latin, let alone Italian. So the vocabulary itself is a major struggle. At the bottom, a splash. Just incidentally interesting, noting you see the two bodies dropped into water. He noted that a triangular body rather rapidly produces concentric ripples, as would a longitudinal body. And he's very interested in the way in which waves intersect without interfering. But anyway, there's a little splash at the bottom, which is pretty good, isn't it? He'd got a real sense as to how to do this in a non-conventional way. Nobody else drew splashes like that. But it was really only in the early 20th century as stroboscopic photography that we could get a picture of a splash in action. The ones on the left are by Arthur Worthington in 1908, very early, some of the earliest of such photography. A sphere dropped into milk. Milk has an advantage of being more viscous, and you can actually get the corona to form rather brilliantly. And the page beside it, and the illustration, in fact, is not from Worthington, that's from Darcy Thompson's great classic On Growth and Form from 1517, which we're continuing to work on. And the Journal of Interdisciplinary Science Studies, we're going to do 1 or 2 issues on Thompson and modern biology as well as historical biology. Anyway, Thompson is always interested in perceptions of form in related media which didn't have an explanation. Sometimes there wasn't an explanation going to come out, or maybe it's still in the future. But in this page, you see him comparing the drops to medusoids and polyps, these gelatinous organisms which obviously shape themselves, organize themselves in relation to the behavior of thick and thin fluids. And on the left-hand page of the Thomson is a diagram of viscous fluids dropping down into less viscous ones and creating this ramifying structure, what we would now think of as a self-similar structure, a fractal structure, as it cascades down. For a lot of Thomson's work was hugely intuitive. He said it's all preface because he didn't have mechanisms. These mechanisms are, for many of these things, are now emerging with some of the new biological sciences. The corona itself became something of an icon. Most of you, if you know it at all, know it via Edgerton's work at Strobe Alley. He's the man who did the photographs of bullets through apples and related things. And this was a very popular student poster. I don't know how many of you have ever had this. But it's become a kind of iconic image, the corona splash. And for a time where I live in Oxfordshire, milk-marked lorries were grinding around the road with simplified coronas. I spoke to the man at the depot and I said, do people really recognise this? And he said, well, not entirely. So it disappeared. It wasn't entirely successful branding, but it at least some branding merchant thought that it would do the job, and it's well enough known to do so. And a particularly nice example, a British artist, craftsman called Mark Vickers, working with a Nesta grant, National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, did a series of splash plates and pots. Very beautiful, I think. Water is a supercooled liquid, but these are actually to be manufactured industrially, so they're not formed by the process. But there is a sense that he has felt that glass, it's a wonderful formal expression for glass, even if it is not formed in a splash-like manner. So there's a kind of intuition which comes in by the back door, as it were, and creates something that looks inherently right, and we can imagine this is formed by a splash, but it's absolutely not. It's still very beautiful. And as I say, and the theme of this lecture is almost getting into unexpected places, who owned the 1945 edition of D'Arcy Thompson's Growth and Form but Jackson Pollock, the notorious dripper? Why would Jackson Pollock, at a key point, this is when he's just beginning to use process as the primary mode of expression in his art, what is Jackson Pollock doing with this book? The image of Jackson Pollock is the wild American boy who sort of pisses in the snow with his father, and not an intellectual at all. But he's got Thompson's Growth and Form. Now, I'm not coming up with a causal mechanism and saying this is what caused the dripping, but you can see that somebody who is interested in how viscous fluids behave when you stretch them out, when you drip them, when you move them fast, from his paint cans or from his brushes, painting on the floor. So the idea that this is not random, but there is some kind of strange, what we would now think of self-organizing factors involved in this, would have been very attractive to Pollock and would help him articulate his interests, if not actually to cause him to start dripping. We know on the larger scale Pollocks, and this is one of the mature large-scale Pollocks, that they have a kind of fractal order built into them, that if you zoom in, the space-filling properties of his overlaid marks are remarkably constant. And the article published on this actually irons out the graph more than it should, but nonetheless it is very striking. And I suspect if you and I did this dripping, we wouldn't get a satisfactory fractal structure with self-similarity, with equal space-filling properties as you go down the scales or zoom into it. I haven't tried it, but I suspect not. And in a sense, this is a kind of lecture with lateral associations rather than constructed along logical lines. splashes as the subject of the work of art. This is Andy Goldsworthy, best known, of course, for his structures of rocks, wood, etc. But he did a series of splashes which were photographed. And he got very involved, and this is near Penpont in Dumfriesshire, where he lives, with how could you get the best splashes. The one on the left is formed by throwing stones in, but he tried beating water with a stick to get particular splashes. Doing so on a sunny day, he suddenly realized he was generating a rainbow, and the rainbow became the subject of interest. And this, for me, is a wonderful sort of metaphor, or whatever you like to call it, for how artists and scientists often proceed, that what you're looking at, suddenly that's the thing over there, which is the big deal. It's the kind of distraction or the noise, and suddenly the noise becomes the subject, or the unwanted intrusion, which is stopping him from looking at the splashes, becomes the subject of the work. And again, just looking at Midas as one of the works here, this sense of process, of randomness, but not randomness. If you watch this forming, it actually moves out in a rather fractal way, rather like sort of Mandelbrot sets invading the surrounding area. But these kind of topics, for me, are not just historical, they're not just contemporary, but they take us to some of the big enduring issues of order and disorder, which have concerned scientists and artists from time immemorial. These two quotations are taken from Philip Bull's recent trilogy of books. I'd recommend particularly the single gathered book called The Self-Made Tapestry. This is about entropy as the ultimate devoid of order, of the total uniformity of things as a prediction of the end of stuff, as it were. As the physicist Roderick Dewar puts it, far from equilibrium, the coexistence of ordered and dissipative regions produces and exports more entropy to the environment than a purely dissipative soup. And so, according to Rod Svensson, this is a little bit later in the Phil Wall page, according to Rod Svensson of the University of Connecticut, the world can be expected to produce order when it gets the chance. Now, I'm not again saying these are right or wrong, but it shows how these issues, signalled by the splash, signalled by the kind of things which Murray Garib is looking at in the heart, this notion of order, disorder, these are still the fundamental questions and will remain so of science and, of course, of great concern to artists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kemp. I suppose, what's interesting to me is that these kinds of associations between art and science. I see your work in a way as you're sort of a founder of what's become a field now, which is the art science field, which has only existed for a sort of a short time, but what we found is that people have been discussing links between art and science, and this was something we were talking about before. The connection between art and science is something that's existed for a very long time, and you can even push it perhaps further back than Leonardo. But something that's interesting now, I think, is the emergence of new sort of spaces, meeting places for art and science. Science Gallery is perhaps one of them, but there's lots of other spaces popping up around the world, and the Le Laboratoire in Paris, or in Katz's Symbiotica lab in Australia. Why do you think this is? It's something that I kind of am puzzled by. What's going on here? Why are we suddenly seeing this emergence of hybrid places where art and science come together?
I think it's probably resistant to a single explanation, but I think the first thing I would say is the phase in art and science, which we can date, say, from late 19th century to relatively recently, has been the aberration in terms of how the disciplines have reacted and seen each other. You had science is becoming incredibly specialist, setting up their own colleges, their own areas with jargons to keep everybody out. And the arts did it at exactly the same time. You know, the Royal College of Art and all these sort of things, the College of Engineers. So we spent a lot of time from the mid to late 19th century onwards creating territories which were highly specialised and were designed in part to keep other people out. And I think that's an aberration in historical terms, in long terms. You know, you don't see that in the 18th century and earlier. And I would like to think what we're seeing now is a more normal conquest of spaces, intellectual spaces, which clever, creative people have done in the past. I mean, art went through what I think, you know, I absolutely love American abstract expressionism, but it went through this phase where it says art is about art is about art. You know, it's a flat thing, painting is a flat thing, it's on a flat surface. It resulted in some terrific paintings, but it's a very artificial thing. I mean, great art has always engaged with the cutting issues in society, whether they're religious or whether they're about nature or whatever. And the cutting issues, clearly as represented by Oren's work and by the gallery, is now science. I think it's natural for artists to be engaging with these things, and equally I think it's natural for scientists who are dealing with things which are very challenging to visualize and communicate, to look to artists not for lessons but to see what symbiosis occurs. So that's a slightly rambling answer, but my view is if we were 50 years on, we would look back as this more the state of normal cultural activity with very curious, creative people, and look at the previous bit as rather an aberration.
You drew out certain parallels in this sort of investigative exploration, this sort of thinking about looking at things on the side between both art and science, which would suggest in a way that there's a lot in common between art and science when one is in this zone of intuition, when the science hasn't yet been resolved. What's the difference?
Yeah.
In what way is art fundamentally different from science for you?
Yeah, could I start by just issuing a caution, which I should have issued before? I'm not intending this as a universal explanation of art and science. There's a lot of art and science that doesn't fit that, so I'm not making a claim beyond the kind of itches I had, you know, looking at these things as a kid. So it's a very particular kind of interest in form, pattern, dynamic movement. So it's not meant to be a universal explanation. And the commonality for me is very important in terms of these deep structural interests. To generalize, and I think this works tolerably well, but again, I wouldn't want to push it absolutely to a point of rigidity. When a scientist investigates the phenomenon, they're wanting to come up with a way of expressing it, modeling it, with as little ambiguity as possible. The scientific paper is not meant to invite you in and leave you with about 6 different interpretations. We've probably all read papers that do that, but that's not the aim. The aim of the scientific explanation is to create a field of precise data with precise analysis, and you're not inviting the spectator, the reader, to do what they want to with it. You couldn't stop them, but that's not the intention behind it. Whereas the artist, and great art I think is particularly good at this, creates a field which is pointing you in a direction, but it's not telling you what to do. So it's an open field, and the spectator, listener, viewer, whatever, completes it according to their own imaginative life. So the end products, I think, are different, and I'm talking really in terms of relatively modern art and science, but I think if we think about it as the job of the reader or spectator in relation to their imaginative life, then I think they're different products, they work in different ways. One is not superior to the other, but generally you find if you go into laboratories, if you talk to scientists, they're full of analogy. They're full of saying, you know, well, I think that's a bit like that.
Yes.
This doesn't get through to the papers, and I'm not saying it should. Some popular science writing is rather good at it, but I'm interested at finding a certain style of commonality behind certain arts and sciences. Yeah.
We had one question here and then one over here. Yeah, one here first. Yeah.
Hi there. When you were speaking earlier about sand piles and the pairback theory, you mentioned about self-organised criticality or something like that applied to traffic jams. Could you speak a little bit more about that and whether it also can apply to congregations or movements of people?
Wow. Yeah, basically you're looking, the sand pile is a model for something that gets to a critical point where it is no longer sustainable and something happens of a more or less catastrophic nature. So in your traffic jam, you get to the point where the situation, as one knows very much in London, you only need one car parked in a slightly bad position, and that triggers this cascade of events. And it's proved, Pairback I think makes excessive claims for it probably, but it proves a very nice way of modelling something which undergoes that sort of problem. The collapse of something, the collapse of a structure, they can be analysed according to this critical moment where you get a sort of build-up and the structure is stable and then suddenly it goes. You can't predict when, and you can't predict to what extent. You would think you could, but and it's one reason, obviously, why predicting earthquakes and eruptions is such a...
Does that apply to our banks, Martin, do you think?
It applies to my bank account at the moment, I have to say, yeah. So
we had one question here and then one up there. Yes, yeah.
Yes,
you're
hello.
next. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm just interested in the image that you chose for the front of your book, Scene Unseen,
yeah.
the Nautilus shell, and presumably I know Leonardo and his friend Pacioli are very interested in the Fibonacci and theories of beauty and divine proportion and so on.
Yeah.
So were you looking at that as some way that would be of interest to both scientists and artists? Or?
The way the cover came about is I know, and have known since she was an art student in Dundee, Catherine McIntyre, who is an independent artist but does a lot of work in science journals. And I said, you know, Oxford University Press don't design books very well. Visually, they're a wonderful publisher, but visually they're very boring. I'm trying to get my next book. I've told the designer ready to go for it, but they produce well-produced but rather conventional books. So I thought I'll try to preempt them doing their own cover. So I said to Catherine McIntyre, do you want to look at the book and come up with a cover? And that's what she did. It's called The Birth of Venus, in fact, because there's a female body traceable in there emerging from the Nautilus shell, which is not the Botticellian image. So she got in a sense, the kind of visual resonances without making it too literal. And I think it works beautifully, yeah. The book I'm writing at the moment is called Christ to Coke, and it's on iconic images. And in science, I've got the double helix and E equals mc squared as icons. But there I've got a French designer I know doing the cover. So I'm preempting Oxford University Press's lack of visual sensitivity. Hopefully no UP people here.
They're watching online.
I'd like to ask, have you historicized these things in any kind of, how shall I say, more deliberate way, asking why the perception of certain shapes and forms become historically possible, and how that then is shown up in ideas of science and representations in aesthetic form? Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a sense this is, for a historian, it's a kind of irresponsible lecture because one's following thematic things without even asking how they can occur at that particular moment, why they occur, as far as that's answerable. But I have looked, for instance, at the coming and going of the interest in the geometric solids, in terms of, and of spiral formations, and how those are embedded in certain concerns and social contexts and other contexts. Yeah. So this, in a sense, is looking at the continuities, but not asking why does that particular form of that thing occur at that point in that time, which of course is a proper historical question. So, yeah, there's in the seen and unseen. There's a deal of straight, old-fashioned historical embedding of the motifs. So I'm interested in plotting this continuity in relation to the whole range of contexts which affect the image-making business.
I'm wondering, Martin, in terms of artist-scientist collaborations, I mean, much of what you talked about was individual artistic processes or scientific processes, but are there things that you're seeing emerging in terms of processes of collaboration between artists and scientists that you think are particularly fruitful or actually don't work? I mean, it'd be interesting to know, because there's an exploding amount of work in this area right now.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
You know, have you seen any particularly good processes?
Yeah, I'm going to have to answer that because I'm doing a longer essay in Nature and Artist in Labs. So being here at this moment with Symbiotica parading their wares is a very good thing. It's very difficult to answer that in a compact form because there are almost as many answers as there are collaborations with different people, different temperaments, different subjects, and so on. At their worst, I think you get what I call the cuddly creator syndrome, where you get somebody goes into a lab and the scientists find that this person is not completely wild and is actually a serious professional, and the artists find that the scientists are not dry, incomprehensible people, but they're full of imaginative lives and so on. And everybody feels warm and cuddly about it, but actually nothing much comes out of it beyond that. At the other extreme, something which makes the scientist and the artist both look at their productive work in a quite different way. Somebody who was a student of mine, Marta de Menezes, who you know, Portuguese artist, who is very much involved in trying to get a Symbiotica going in Portugal, one of the things she did in one of the labs was to make a protein on the basis of the letters of her name. And Portuguese, as you know, have prodigiously long names in their full form. And in the lab, they'd never made a protein which had no template before. And to make a protein on a totally non-biological set of letters was, and they're now wondering what they can do with this or other proteins of the same kind. The difficulty with this area, and it's something I shall be writing about, and I talked to Oren a bit about, is that often it's the process which is the excitement, and it's the process which engages people, and the actual final artifact isn't the thing in a way. It's like looking at the blood wars there. Now that's a nice artifact, but it's only a kind of residue. Oren called it a relic of the process. Is that right? Where is he? Yeah. Something relic you called it. Yeah, relic of the performance, yeah.
We will be having another Blood Wars next week, actually.
Yeah.
If anyone wants to get their blood taken, there'll be a last opportunity.
So I think to a degree, that kind of work, which is about process experiment, and it's the what goes on is more than the end point in a way. It's a bit like autodestructive art or something. You've not got to say, is this producing a sensational artifact, which is going to sit in the Tate Gallery or in the Museum of Modern Art or wherever.
I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, some of the most interesting action, I suppose, is happening around the lab space in this particular show, where you see Kathy High sometimes with a phlebotomist, and they're either they've just taken blood from people or else they're beginning the protocol, and it's that kind of. It's both the process of making, and then what you get now is more like a documentation partly of the process.
Yeah.
But any other questions out there? Yes, we got one over here. Yeah.
You began with Einstein's claim of a pre-linguistic semiotic intuition, and you've provided us with wonderful examples. The splash is a wonderful example of how something from nature then is turned into something artistic. But it reminded me of the North American, the American linguist Benjamin Lee Whorf and his work on Native American languages. I just wondered whether this problem with linguistic formulation is also to do with the structure of Western languages, or does in fact the research that you've done turn the tables on Benjamin Lee Whorf? Because I think it's the Hopi language. He shows how they, in their language, they can express the link between, I think, a splash and a wave. I can't remember exactly.
Yeah.
But does this, I think his hypothesis was that, language determines thought, really. But does this actually sort of disprove that?
I'm not sure. Disprove is not a word I would use, but it was very fashionable at one time to say that because the Eskimos had all these words of snow, that this was a different way of seeing. In fact, the Eskimos have two words for snow, one on the ground and one on the air, and they have adjectives which describe them, as I understand it. Much like Foucault's Chinese dogs in Les Mots et les Choses, The Order of Things as it was translated, where he says the Chinese have this classification where they're classified into owned by the emperor, rabid, and other categories which don't correspond to ours at all. And I got rather interested in that business of what now you call ethnobiology, of looking at classifications in biology, which I'm much better on than anything in linguistics as such. And the Foucault, Les Mots et les Choses, I actually chased that up because the reference was to a German editor of Chinese texts, whose name I've just temporarily forgotten, so it will come back to me. It's a major editor and edited encyclopedias and all sorts of things. Anyway, I went to the School of Oriental African Studies and I went through this man's bibliography and could find nothing at all about this encyclopedia. But it turns out that Foucault got it from Borges. And Borges has invented one of his wonderful fictions, which then became cemented. And I then wrote to the Needham Institute, this shows how irritating I am in following these things up. I wrote to the Needham Institute in Cambridge and said, is this a conceivable Chinese classification of dogs? And they said no. And my feeling is that, yes, languages are different, that but it happens in the same language. For instance, and this is appropriate for Ireland, somebody who knows a great deal about horses will have all sorts of different names for horses at different stages and what they do and so on. Basically, for me, they're either ponies or horses or foals. So, yeah, according to interest, we have ways of naming things, and clearly they relate to seeing, in that the person who can name all these different sorts of horses according to age and so on clearly is able to make visual discrimination. So there is a play between the language and the level of visual discrimination, but it's not as simple as certainly was very fashionable in art history at one time, as saying all looking is directed via verbal categories. And I've been assaulted on a number of occasions at dinners afterwards by people saying, well, what about all the Eskimo words for snow? And right. And there has been serious research on that, so I'm not... I did the research on the Foucault Chinese Encyclopedia, but there have been a number of people who have hacked away at the Eskimo words for snow, which became in art history a kind of factoid at one point. It became something that everybody was citing as examples of verbally directed looking. It's complicated, as you know, as you will know, I think.
We just have time for a couple more questions. I think there's one over here and one over here. Yeah. So, who's going to get first? Do you want to start?
I'm just wondering if it's at the end of your talk, you mentioned the idea of entropy and order, and it reminded me of the ideas of Erwin Schrödinger in What Is Life, of negentropy, the force of negentropy. I was wondering if it's fair to interpret the talk in general as, from the beginning of looking at a child, looking at the vortex in the bathtub, is just that this, whether it's a scientist or an artist, is that this awareness of this negentropic force that actually is in the universe, as opposed to, there's a lot of science that generally they talk about the decay of the universe and so on, but we don't talk about this force that is actually creating form and order around us.
Yeah. It's easy in this area to get into a kind of Suits Corner sector, but my feeling is that this age-old dialogue, whether it's called such, between order and entropy, has been profoundly engaged, engaged artists, not in a necessarily conscious way, that we could look, for instance, at a Leonardo painting, take the Mona Lisa as most obvious example, that there is a clear invitation to see structure, to see order, to see indeed mental order in it. Yet ultimately, if you look into it, you don't see lines, you don't see edges. And I've been working with some high-resolution images of the Mona Lisa, and it collapses remarkably quickly into a kind of visual entropy. There's nothing. So I think there is that sort of dialogue going on, but this is really just a bit of irresponsible thinking at the moment, and I wouldn't wish to go beyond that, but I quite like that kind of irresponsibility, that it might be worthless, but I think being a bit irresponsible and taking the risk of saying something which seems pretentious and overwrought is a risk worth taking.
Great, thank you. And Zach?
I was wondering if you could say a word about patronage and privilege, because I was just struck by Leonardo and then abstract expressionism in the CIA, right? This sort of narrative that exists, and it is in this sort of certain economic crisis we're in. Do you see positive signs or hope for value in the arts and the humanities, maybe separate from science?
There are, yeah. And as a historian, you can virtually every person I looked at worked within really definable economic structures, often of private patronage. And Leonardo, to some extent, he was a sort of brush for hire, but he really needed court support to do what he did. He needed to be treated as a kind of intellectual ornament, to be given that license. My fear for the arts and sciences, particularly the sciences, who I think are selling the pass at the moment, is that increasingly as economic conditions bite, the politicians will say, and other people will say, we will do the science if it's useful. The humanities are not very obviously useful in that sense, but we get by with a certain amount of special pleading. But let's think about the sciences for the moment. And I was on the university court at St Andrews, and we went round and we visited we had these sort of regal visitations to the science labs, science departments. And I don't remember going to any lab without the scientists saying to us, of course, this has all these economic potential benefits. And a number of these scientists I knew personally, and they were blue skies scientists who were just obsessed, say, with how a laser behaves or what happens at the lowest temperatures. But they felt obliged to say, I am not doing this because this is one of the great quests you can imagine. I'm doing this because it will help in such and such a way. And my worry is that as as economic pressures come down, so the funding bodies, encouraged by scientists who see an advantage in this, will go for the utilitarian argument. And I think that's dead dangerous in any intellectual discipline. The scientists can sell the past better than we can in humanities, but ultimately it's a past sold. And I think we've got to still keep a grip that arts and sciences are one of the... Human beings do a lot of terrible things, but they are things that we do which are great human quests and what make us a species to be admired. And I think if the scientists don't join with us in the humanities in saying we are investigating the fundamental state of the universe, whether it's inside our minds or in the cosmos, unless we join together and say we're both in this fundamental thing and it's what we do, economic benefits will come in a sense, as we know. I knew one of the laser scientists, which was very much your area, I think, in St Andrews, and that didn't begin as a practical operation. Watson and Crick, that was not a practical thing. They were both obsessed, Watson in particular, with how genetic material replicated, but it wasn't the human genome. They didn't think that they had the solution to diseases. Indeed, whether the human genome does is another matter. But so, yeah, the historian can say these great things like Mendelian genetics came from people with itches to scratch, great human quests. And I'd make an appeal for scientists to join with us in keeping this notion of the basic human quest for deep understanding at the centre of our activities. Sorry, that's a sermon. But
So rather than a divorce between art and science, it may be more of a unity around non-utilitarian investigation, or this looking to the side that you've been...
Yeah. I would say it's functional but non-utilitarian.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. So unfortunately, I think we're going to have to end it there. I have one final question for you. Is it a cuboctahedron?
No. Well, there is a cube. There is a cube. There is a cube. Oh no! What you get? Yeah. No, you keep working on it. No.
All right. Okay. We have, as I mentioned, we have some books that Professor Kemp is willing to sign, the Seen Unseen books. Just a few of them. So if you're interested, please come down to the front. And I would like to just close off by warmly thanking Professor Martin Kemp for this wonderfully stimulating lateral or looking to the side discussion tonight. Thank you very much. Thanks.